Please respect my position that some information regarding the evidence cannot be discussed, as we do not want to jeopardize the prosecution of this case. And I also want to be sensitive to the victim. I'll open with brief remarks and then introduce the following. Mark Henderson, who can further discuss his involvement in the decision to review this matter in 2015. FBI Assistant Special Agent in Charge Jeremy Bell, who can discuss the involvement of the FBI locally and across the country, who assisted us in the investigation, to include the Cold Case Working Group from Western New York. Chief of the Domestic Violence Bureau, William Gargan, can discuss in general terms the grand jury process, the upcoming trial, and the trial process moving forward. Brighton Town Supervisor William Malley, who can discuss the impact this murder had on the community. Lastly, please hold all your questions until the end. We are here today to discuss the arrest and a homicide investigation from February 19th, 1982, which occurred more than 37 years ago. Before we begin, I want to thank our law enforcement partners. The District Attorney's Office, particularly our District Attorney Sandra Dorley, who gave us the full support of our office, to include Chief of the Domestic Violence Bureau, William Gargan, who has already dedicated numerous hours of preparation to this case. Members of the District Attorney's Investigative Unit, Investigators Doug Bicardo and Sam Soprano. FBI Assistant Special Agent in Charge Jeremy Bell and Special Agent Chad Castle, along with their team, who were there at the beginning. Lastly, members of our staff, both current and retired, especially Investigator Stephen Hunt and retired Investigator Mark Libertor, who are with us today. It is because of the team you see next to me and some who are not present with us today who are the reason we were able to bring this case forward. All of them played a role in this case, and I thank them for their service. On February 19th, 1982, at about 5 p.m., Brighton police responded to a 911 call from a neighbor of the defendant in this matter, James Krauseneck, Jr. When officers arrived at the neighbor's house, they were ultimately led to the home of James, his wife Kathleen, and their daughter Sarah, who resided at 33 Del Rio Drive. Officers arrived at the house to find Kathleen deceased. She died from a single blow to her head from an axe. What followed was an extensive investigation that led Brighton police officers, Brighton investigators, and Brighton chiefs of police across the United States to Mount Clemens, Michigan, Fort Collins, Colorado, Lynchburg, Virginia, Gig Harbor, Washington, and Houston, Texas. Hundreds, if not thousands, of investigative hours went into this case over the last few decades. 4 years ago, now retired Chief of Police Mark Henderson requested a fresh look into the investigation, which included boxes of investigative material and the testing of evidence in our possession. With the assistance from the FBI, the Monroe County Crime Lab, and the Monroe County District Attorney's Office, the investigation led us to where we are today. I understand people want a singular piece of evidence that can directly point to James Krauseneck, Jr. This is not one of those cases. You have to look at the totality of the circumstances along with all the evidence in the timeline of events. DNA, fingerprints, or the lack thereof can speak volumes. James lived at 33 Del Rio Drive, and one would suspect his DNA would be in his house. It is telling no other physical evidence at the scene, to include DNA, points to anyone other than James Krauseneck, Jr. During this investigation, we have consulted with Dr. Michael Baden, a world-renowned forensic pathologist who has over 45 years of experience in his field. He was a chief medical examiner for New York City, has conducted over 20,000 autopsies, and is considered an expert in his field. We believe in examining the timeline of events, speaking with witnesses, and James's timeline that he provided, along with all other evidence, will establish that James Krauseneck, Jr. was home at the time of the murder. James Krauseneck, Jr. surrendered to authorities on Friday, November 8th, at the Hall of Justice in Rochester, where he's charged with murder in the second degree by way of a grand jury indictment. He was arraigned by State Supreme Court Justice Charles Schiano, Jr. and released on $100,000 bail after surrendering his passport. James Krauseneck Jr. is 67 years of age and resides in Peoria, Arizona. After the arraignment last Friday, myself, investigators Hunt, Libertor, and retired Chief of Police Mark Henderson called members of the Schlosser family to announce that an arrest was made. They were grateful for our efforts and plan to attend the upcoming trial next year. Let us not forget the victim. Her name was Cathleen Krauseneck, whose maiden name was Schlosser. She was 29 years old at the time of her death and was married to James, who was 30 years old at the time of the commission of this crime. They had been married since 1974, which was approximately 8 years. They shared one daughter together who was at home during the commission of the crime. The daughter, Sarah, was only 3.5 years old. This is one of the worst outcomes of domestic violence this agency has investigated, and this was domestic violence. In closing, I'll quote deceased Brighton Chief of Police Eugene Shaw, who stated during a February 11, 1983 interview with the Times-Union, when asked if the case will end with a successful prosecution, he stated, "I'm not known to be a pessimist, so optimistically, I'd say hopefully, yes," end quote. Please know that the police across this region will never forget our victims. These cases stay with us forever. We know we are the only ones able to speak for victims. We will investigate cases like this as long as it takes, and we will use all of our investigative abilities to bring justice for the victims and their families. Thank you. Now let me introduce retired Chief of Police Mark Henderson.
Thank you, Chief. I started with the Brighton Police Department in 1986. I worked with Chief Shaw. This crime had a significant impact on the community, and it had a significant impact on this police department, and it had a significant impact on Chief Shaw. There was a very considerable investigative effort that occurred right from the onset of the reporting of this crime and throughout the years. I know that the inability to bring this case forward really weighed heavily on Chief Shaw. After Chief Shaw, Chief Vocal took over leading this department. The case, as Chief Shaw mentioned, was in the Chief's office. Chief Vocal also looked at the case. Some of the questions that I got, was this a closed case? Did you reopen the case? It was never closed. Throughout Chief Vocal's tenure, there would be information that would come into the police department relative to this case. Investigators were assigned. When I became the Chief of Police in 2010, we continued to get tips and thoughts and leads, prospective leads. Investigators were assigned. In 2015, Brian Bodig, a special agent in charge of the FBI field office, presented to the Monroe County Law Enforcement Council that there was a cold case working group that the FBI had formed in our area, and if anybody had any cases to consider that cold case working group. Came back to the police department, met with the investigators, told them that I was going to relaunch. We're going to start from ground zero with everything that we have, and we're going to do a fresh look at this case. And we were going to work closely with the FBI and all the partners that were part of this cold case working group. Investigator Libertor stepped up. He agreed to be the lead investigator. Investigator Hunt joined Investigator Libertor. We presented this case to the cold case working group. A strategy was formulated and a partnership was gained. We worked closely with the FBI. I want to thank you, Jeremy, and the FBI for everything that you brought to the table. In 1982, there were not computers. Our files, our paperwork was not digitized. One of the first things that the FBI did was to convert everything from handwritten paper to digital, searchable files. The investigators had a theory, had an idea which way to go, met with the District Attorney, Sandra Dorley, and Sandra committed herself, her lawyers, and her investigators to the case, and the investigators started to go on a path. And this path was over a number of years. When I heard that there was an arrest made, or an indictment that was going to be unsealed on Friday, I knew that it would lead to the husband of the individual. One of the things that we were able to do during the course of this investigation that I was able to do as accompanying investigator liberator to Michigan, I met with the Schlosser family. I talked about the commitment that the town of Brighton was going to make to a fresh look of this case. I thank Supervisor Maley and the town board for agreeing to give us any resources that we need relative to this investigation. We sat around in the Schlosser dining room. Investigator Liberator talked about some of the efforts that he and the team had made, and we looked over across the table. Mrs. Schlosser, Kathleen's mother, was alive at the time, and Mr. Schlosser, I assured to them that we would be looking at this case. We would commit every resource that we have in 2015, 2016, bring it to the table, and that justice would be served for their daughter, Kathleen. And at the end of that, we left. We've been in communication throughout the years. Not much more I can talk about the evidence. I'm going to leave that to Chief Cathaldi. And I am just thankful that the district attorney, in particular District Attorney Chief Gargan, that you presented the evidence that we had to the grand jury. And to the members of the grand jury, thank you for returning an indictment.
Thanks, Mark. Next, I'd like to introduce FBI Special Agent in Charge, Jeremy Bell.
Good morning. When I spoke with many of you on Friday following the verdict in the Xerox case, I mentioned the FBI's investigations are primarily about victims. No more so is that true when it comes to these cold cases. To that end, I'd like to start by offering my condolences to Kathleen's family. 37.5 years is a long time to go without any sort of resolution. One of the things the FBI tries to do is serve as a force multiplier for our state and local law enforcement partners. We do that through things like our cold case working group. And while we have a relatively small footprint here in Rochester, we're able to bring our national resources to bear when we partner with our law enforcement partners on cases like this one. We can digitize old case files like we did in this matter. We can make available our laboratory division at Quantico, which is the best in the world. We have our behavioral analysis unit, our profilers, if you will. They're available to assist. These are all resources nationally we're able to bring to bear on cases like this one, local here in Rochester. And I hope this case, and what you saw on Friday with the Xerox matter, serves a couple purposes. One, it's a step towards closure for the victim's family. But two, and just as importantly, I hope it puts criminals everywhere on notice. Just because the years go by doesn't mean you can stop looking over your shoulder. We're coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Next, I'd like to introduce William Gargan, Chief of the Domestic Violence Bureau with the Monroe County District Attorney's Office.
As you know, an indictment was unsealed this past Friday, charging Mr. Krauseneck with 1 count of murder in the 2nd degree. We appeared before Judge Schiano of the New York State Supreme Court, and several dates were set for the progression of this case. We will return to court on January 27th for the argument of motions. He has scheduled preliminarily a hearing date in early March. And then on June 2nd, he has scheduled the trial to begin. Everything we've done, everything we will continue to do, is to ensure that on June 2nd, we have the ability to have 12 strangers from this community look at this evidence and convict Mr. Krauseneck, who as he stands now is innocent until proven guilty. Our goal during that trial will be to bring to bear all of the effort, all of the work, all of the investigation with the members of the Brighton Police Department, members of the FBI, and every other concerned citizen who had information to those 12 jurors. I can tell you that the defense counsel had put out a press release, which allows me, therefore, to respond to that press release. Mr. Wolford talked about the cooperation of Mr. Krauseneck. I think the word cooperation may have a different meaning for Mr. Wolford than it does for me in the Brighton Police Department. As we explore the case through the jury, we hope to share some of that cooperation and some of the absence of that cooperation. Defense counsel made a point of saying that this indictment, this prosecution was and is misguided. I can tell you that there has been only one thing that D.A. Dorley, the Brighton Police Department, and the town of Brighton have sought to do, and that has guided them with everything that they've done. And that is to seek the truth wherever the facts, wherever the evidence may lead them. We're standing here today because of an event from February 19th, 1982. But more importantly, because of the unsealing of the indictment on Friday. As you know, with every case in the state of New York, evidence is presented to a grand jury, and then that evidence and those instructions are reviewed by the judge. There will be several steps that will be undertaken, and we will be subject to review to ensure that on that June 2nd day, we are prepared to present our case to a jury. I look forward to that. The family looks forward to that. This police agency looks forward to that. And this community looks forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Sorry. Next, I'd like to introduce Brighton Town Supervisor William Malley.
In 1982, I had just moved into the Evans Farm neighborhood in Brighton. And I can certainly speak firsthand that this murder, this terrible murder, had a devastating impact on the Brighton community. So I was absolutely grateful when Chief Henderson came to me in 2015, described to me the new program, the cold case program that the FBI was making available, and asked whether I would support and whether the town board would support making the resources available to continue this investigation, which, as the chief has said, had never closed, but perhaps had gone cold. That was an easy decision. Clearly, this community needed closure. I am grateful to you, Chief Mark Henderson, for making that recommendation. To the FBI, you know, a lot of times you see, we all watch those cop shows on TV, and there's sometimes sort of an undertone that maybe the locals and the feds don't play in the same sandbox real well. What you see here is how law enforcement does work together, does cooperate, and I am so appreciative of that work. And the district attorney, Sandra Dorley, and her team all together have brought us to this day. And the condolences that I have for the family and the hope and expectation that what will come out of this will bring to that family some measure of relief. Thank you to everybody here today for all that you've done and for all that I know you will be doing through that June trial date. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark, would you like to thank a few people?
Morning. My name is Mark Libertor. I'm a retired investigator from here at the Brighton Police Department. I retired in August of 2016, and thanks to then Chief Henderson and Supervisor Maley, they've kept me on a retainer to stick with this case. As the case agent, ultimately the responsibility to the chief and the town and the district attorney's office falls to me, but that is all that falls to me. This would not have been possible if it were not for the team that we put together between the DA's office, the FBI, and some local police agencies throughout the state, throughout the country, actually. And I'd like to just take a few minutes. All I want to comment is on thanking the people involved. First and foremost, analyst at the FBI, Debbie Oberhofer. There are many cops in this county that would love to have Debbie's contact information. She was invaluable to this investigation. When we needed information, she was a phone call away, and the information was readily available and relayed to us. And she had a great, from behind the scenes, a great impact on this case. Special Agent Chad Castle from the Rochester FBI office. Chad is assigned to the cold case working group and has been our contact since April of 15 when we reopened this investigation and started doing the case again. Special Agent Terry Pasma from the Seattle and Tacoma FBI office. Terry was phenomenal when Investigator Hunt and I were out in Seattle back in 2016 for a week. He put everything aside, spent the entire week with us. Really, him and his team did a great job, and we appreciate it. His partner, Washington State Trooper Joel Rivas, who has since retired, also another asset. The FBI Crime Lab, phenomenal. Our contacts down there, there is one individual at the crime lab that is the contact for every local police agency in the country that sends evidence down there. And I thought for sure we'd be a number low on the list, but their response was phenomenal. And again, they did a great job for us. New York State Police civilian technician James Kennedy at the State Police Crime Lab. Again, the State Police helped out, reached out, offered their lab some of their expertise, and James and his people were able to help us with some of the evidence that we would not have gotten otherwise. And I just want to thank the team. Back in 2015, then Captain Cathaldi, Chief Henderson, and I went down and talked to DA Sandra Dorley, and she asked what would we need, the police department, and we need some help. And two of the investigators that I really wanted to handpick if I could have them were Doug Baccardo and Sam Soprano, and she assigned them to us. And between those two, myself and Steve Hunt, with Chad's interaction, we were able to bring this case to a closure, and I want to thank those guys. It was absolutely a team effort, and it is about the victim, both Cathleen Krauseneck and, quite frankly, Sarah Krauseneck. This case is about the victims, and I feel that we've done our job. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Anybody else? Doug? Chad? I'll open this up for questions. I just want to, before I forget, at the conclusion of this press conference, all further comments are going to come from two sources. The Chief's office, that would be me, and the Chief of the Domestic Violence Bureau, Bill Gargan. That will be the only official statements and only official sources of contact for any media from this point moving forward. I'll open it up to questions.
I have a question.
Sure.
You said no single piece of information led to this arrest, but what moved the needle forward? Most recently, you've taken a new look at it. Did you have DNA? Did you have some physical evidence? What is it that allowed you to go forward?
Thank you. As I mentioned, you would expect DNA evidence to be in that home. He lived there. What we did not find was any evidence that points to anybody else that was in that home. And I think that speaks volumes. Go ahead.
I mean, I know there were specific items that were sent to the lab, excuse me, Quantico, that were crime scene evidence.
Mm-hmm.
But are you speaking beyond that? There's a lack of DNA beyond just those materials that you sent, or are you talking about solely just those materials that went to the crime lab? Does that make sense?
To my knowledge, there has been no DNA evidence recovered from the home or on any piece of evidence that belongs to anybody else. So there is no, I hate to use the term, there's no boogeyman out there.
Did it take DNA tests that are available now to tell you that?
It did. It was a fresh look at it. And don't get singularly focused on DNA evidence being there or not being there. What I think really cinched this case is the fresh look. And I can't say this enough, and I'm not trying to be flippant about it. The investigative team that was assembled, you've got Doug Baccardo, retired Rochester City Police investigator with dozens of years of experience. You have Stephen Hunt, who's been an investigator here in this department, 15 years experience as a police officer. Mark Libertor, a wealth of knowledge and experience that he brings to the table. The FBI and their cold case group started making us think and look at this case in a totally different way. And again, as I said earlier, bringing on Dr. Michael Baden to confirm the timeline, I strongly believe will show and will prove that Mr. Krauseneck was in the home at the time of the homicide.
Can you elaborate on that?
I don't know what else to say other than the timeline provided. The forensic, Dr. Michael Baden was a forensic pathologist. He reviewed the autopsy. He reviewed a lot of evidence. I believe his testimony will speak for itself when it comes time. I believe the timeline will put Jim Krauseneck at home in the house during the commission of the crime. So there was no, again, there was no outside party in that house during the commission of that crime. That's my belief. I'm not going to mention specific times. I appreciate the question, but again, I'll go back to my point. I don't want to do anything to jeopardize this case. I think it narrows the time.
Question regarding the comments from James Krauseneck's counsel, which I guess is something maybe we want to hear from the DA's office.
Sure.
They opened the door, so they may have done us a favor. They talked about he's been cooperative, and what really did you encounter in trying to deal with him? We've already heard from his counsel, so that door's been open.
As you know, they put out a press release. I can tell you one of his defense team, I believe, is in the room right now, Mr. Taha, so he may be able to answer any specific questions regarding strategy. But they made a point of talking about his cooperation. I mentioned that I would disagree regarding his definition of cooperation within that context. I don't plan on speaking about my specific interpretation of it, but I can tell you that going back to what the chief said, looking at every piece of evidence that was reviewed by the members of the Brighton Police Department and everybody else since 1982 has allowed us to present a case to the grand jury, resulting in an indictment that we believe will withstand judicial review, and we look forward to trying the case in June.
Chief, can you speak at all on the other end of the timeline between 2015 and reopening it in 2019 and the indictment and it turning itself? Can you speak at all, even generally, to what that timeline has looked like? You mentioned some communities that your team had been visiting. Can you fill us in at all on that?
Well, as I said, and I'll ask Mark to come up here in a minute, this case was never closed. I came here in 1999, and there were still officers working in this department that had participated in the investigation of this case. And so it's almost ingrained, it was ingrained at the time that there was this outstanding case, unsolved case on Del Rio Drive, the axe murder. So the case was never closed. As far as the timeline, any time new tips came in, and quite frankly, we had new tips yesterday that came in. They were investigated. They were fielded out, and they were assigned to investigators. If you want, Mark, why don't you come up and you can talk a little bit about, I only became chief 2 months ago. Mark's been here for 10 years, so he'd be a better one to discuss that.
Dan, this case never stopped and then reinvigorated a month ago. Since 2015, since that initial fresh look, there have been certain things that came up. As Investigator Liberatore talked about, you know, we sent our evidence to the FBI laboratory. There are a number of high-profile incidents that occurred across the country that kind of set that back a little bit. And then, you know, when we met with the district attorney's office earlier this year, the final presentation from the investigative team, Bill Gargan stepped up and took that case. That started at point zero. What happened on Friday was a culmination of that effort that started in 2015 to the indictment. It's not over. There's a trial. There's hearings. So if there's anybody out there, and I have seen it portrayed in the media, that this case went cold, it was back-shelved, that never happened. That never happened under Chief Shaw. That never happened under Chief Vocal. Never happened under my administration. And it didn't happen under Chief Cathaldes.
One of the things you talked about was the digital conversion, and then secondly, that a theory was developed. Can you tell us what that theory is or anything about it?
So you all watch cop shows, right? And you all try to figure out something happened, why did it happen? And that digitization, and Chief Gargan talked about the cooperation or maybe the lack thereof of the reporting person in this case. That was all documented very well in 1982. And it was looking at the different things. You know, when I started in 1986, everybody had an opinion, everybody had a theory, everybody had a suspect. You couldn't go to a coffee shop without somebody talking about this case. why don't you just make an arrest, right? So as this fresh look started in 2015, you had all this stuff that was gathered, and it was reported as a burglary, and you went down a path. And then at some point during the investigation, it shifted. And it was the cooperation of this team that looked and ran down every aspect. You know, an investigation will bifurcate, it'll go in a different direction. This team ran down every lead of that bifurcation.
So what direction did it go in?
And it led to an indictment where the individual, Mr. Krauseneck, was arrested last Friday.
But can you share the theory with us?
I'm just, I'll leave it to the chief, he's speaking.
I guess, if you could elaborate, I'm not quite sure of the theory that,
Oh, well, you said you developed a new, you said there were theories all along. Well, obviously something either changed or you were able to substantiate the theory you always had. But
well,
what did you mean when you said you developed a new theory?
you know, I don't think I can answer that. As far as developing a new theory, we went where the evidence took us. We followed the timeline that James provided us. We further investigated that timeline. We looked at all the evidence, all the crime scene photos. And it can't be understated that the digitization of the file, when we're talking 1982, everything was handwritten. You're talking boxes of files that had to be digitized so they can be reviewed in a searchable format. And further, I think the timeline is going to be crucial to this case. This is just one of those cases where it's a timeline case. It's not a proverbial smoking gun. And I think that the expert, Dr. Michael Baden, will provide further insight to that when it gets closer to trial.
You characterize this as a domestic violence incident. Did you find other incidents of that leading up to that day?
So this was 1982. I was in 8th grade in high school. I don't even know if domestic violence was a term that had been coined yet. I don't know. I know when I came on as a police officer, domestic violence laws were changing. There was mandatory documentation. There was mandatory arrest policies. I don't think that existed in 1982. So there
would have been friend testimony or other people who might have given you new insights that you didn't have?
I'm not sure about new insights, but I know there is some witnesses that may indicate that, but I'm not going to speak any further to that specifically.
Were there calls for service to the house?
I don't have that information. I could get that. I could probably get that for you, but I don't have that with me today.
So when you say witnesses who can, no, you said you're not going to speak further, but I'll ask
Yeah,
another question.
that's fine.
Do you believe them to be credible or not, the witnesses who could speak to possible incidents?
I think so. You know, I spoke to a retired officer here just the other day. He spent weeks in the neighborhood talking to people. Weeks, on foot, knocking on doors. We talked to a lot of people back in 1982 relative to this. As far as, I'm not going to release any names of people who may or may not be a potential witness, but I think we thoroughly exhausted all of the witnesses and spoke to.
You've run down a list of cities that your investigators have traveled to, and without obviously, did you speak at all to why those communities were relevant?
Sure, I can, here, let me reference my notes. I can start right at the top. Mount Clemens, Michigan is where the Schlosser family is from. That's where I believe the body was initially buried. Chief Shaw went, I may want to let Mark talk a little bit about that because I know Chief Shaw went out there. Mark also went out there. The next one that I had was, let's see, hold on one second. Fort Collins, Colorado. That's where he attended school. Lynchburg, Virginia was where he was teaching. Gig Harbor, Washington is where Mr. Krauseneck lived at the time. Houston, Texas was where Sarah lived. If you want to talk further about Mount Clemens, Michigan.
So our file, and a number of you had reported, you know, there was some very thorough reporting at the time that Mr. Krauseneck left the town of Brighton shortly after the initial report. I did see notes and references to investigators that had traveled out to Michigan to try to establish some communication and some cooperation, if you will. And then through this reporting over the weekend, there's a lot of file footage of the investigative team out in Michigan. You know, as far as what I can personally testify to right now to you, as I traveled, we traveled into Traverse City, Michigan, drove north a number of hours, and sat around a table with Kathleen's family and listened to the impact that that crime had on them, their hopes and aspirations for justice. And again, I assured them, as did Investigative Liberator, that this team would put 100% effort on it, and it would take us to where it took us. And it led to an indictment on Friday.
Did Mr. Krauseneck, when you went to Gig Harbor, did Mr. Krauseneck talk to any of the investigators?
Again, that's part of the case, and it's...
Yeah, that's part of the case. I won't release that at this time. It'll come out during subsequent trial.
Was this case ever presented to the grand jury in the past? We were looking at old reports that we were doing around 1985. Polito was in the...
Not to my knowledge.
And he was
Not...
talking about it being eminent at that time. So I'm just curious if it was presented and no bill, not presented.
No, not to my knowledge. And again, it's the grand jury process is the way to go for this. It's community members that are deciding whether or not there's probable cause to exist, and I think that was the best avenue for this case.
So you're saying lack of cooperation. So basically, Mr. Krauseneck, disappeared and stopped working with you guys. He was not cooperative.
I didn't say lack of cooperation. I think cooperation is a subjective term. As Chief Gargan pointed out, his counsel is here in the room. You can feel free to speak to him, and he can gauge his level of cooperation and speak more to that. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
The DNA, but just one more question on that. So you send the evidence down to the lab. It had been, based on what we heard, it had been wiped clean to some degree. Was there an ability to get, whether touch DNA or whatever, from the ball or the axe or something? Well, you talked about how nobody else's DNA was found anywhere else. I guess I'm wondering, was his DNA on any of the crime scene evidence that was sent to the lab?
So, again, not to get into specifics of the evidence, obviously I don't want to hinder the prosecution of this case. I can tell you when we reached out to the FBI, we asked for everything that was available in 2015. Touch DNA was available in 2015. Small sample DNA was available, and all that level of testing occurred on the evidence that was resubmitted to Quantico.
Yeah, please understand, as I said earlier, it's been 37 and a half years. At this stage, I am responsible for the members of this agency. I don't want to do anything that jeopardizes the prosecution of this case. We've come too far, it's been too long, and this family deserves justice, and they deserve their day in court.
Mark Liberatore, how long was this sitting in front of you? Can you come up and tell us? We hear about these things dragging on and on.
Since April of 2015, so 4.5 years.
And did you know there was going to be an answer, or were you sitting there wondering this whole time? What was that process like?
You have to work the case from beginning to end and do the best you can do with it. So, but like I said, my only comment was to thank the members. I appreciate your question, but just to thank the members of the team.
Who got to tell Mr. Krauseneck he'd been indicted?
That's done through the district attorney's office. It was a sealed indictment. They worked behind the scenes to arrange for his surrender. Good, everybody? Thank you. Any further questions comes through the office of the Chief of Police here in the town of Brighton or the Monroe County District Attorney's Office, Chief of the Domestic Violence Bureau, Bill Gargan. Those will be the only official sources of information. Thank you.
You want to stick around?